Good afternoon. How are we all doing? Good? Hi, I am Ashley Troth. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a second, but I am the Extension Horticulture Agent here in Durham County. Tree Keepers is one of my trainings I do. I really enjoy doing it. It's more of a partnership. You might also have seen me from kind of general gardening talks throughout the community, or you might have seen the Master Gardeners at tabling at events. You might have seen their talks, you might have seen whatever. So as part of my position, I oversee the Master Gardeners as well. And part of what I want to do kind of before we dive into it even too much is I would actually like to just have everyone say their name and maybe like one thing they're hoping to get out of class, just like one quick thing. Does that sound okay? Well, we're doing it, so it sounds good. All right, do you want to go first? Awesome. Yeah, cool. So we will cover really a lot of this over the series of the class. For the folks who are really interested in fruit trees, we'll talk about that a tiny bit today, but not very much. I'll be totally honest. This is focused more on ornamentals. But what I will say is that when you're growing fruit trees, there are very specific ways to prune them that like an orchardist would do, okay? It produces highly productive, but for most people, very ugly trees, okay? And so I would like to say that a lot of what you're going to learn in next week's class about structural pruning and how you kind of create the shape of a tree, it's most applicable to ornamentals, but you can certainly use it on fruit trees to kind of create a tree that's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than a traditionally like fruit tree pruning approach. And I'll share some follow-up classes and resources you can get into if you're interested into the fruit tree pruning and fruit trees in general, because we have a lot of resources on that. This is just focused a little bit more towards ornamentals, because fruit trees are kind of their own wonderful, weird beast. But I think a lot of what I heard we are going to cover, and if there's anything that we don't cover, you can always shoot me an email. And just to share, classes are recorded. I'll be sharing my slides afterward and a link to the recording. If you can't make it to a class, we just ask that you watch the recording. If you want to do the tree keeper training to serve as a tree keeper, and I'll talk more about that program in a second. And I'll share some other follow-up resources just that I think you might find interesting, right? And you can always shoot me an email. Answering your weird tree questions or just weird plant questions is literally my job. So whatever comes to you, right, just send it to me. So let's talk for a second first about the Tree Keeper program itself. So this is a partnership. Tree Keepers are a partnership between a couple of entities across Durham. So originally this program was founded as a partnership between the City of Durham, Keep Durham Beautiful, and another entity called Trees Durham that has since disbanded. So right now it's City of Durham, Keep Durham Beautiful. They are working together, doing amazing work to plant hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of street trees every year. And what they really need is they need volunteers who can serve as kind of lead volunteers to lead those tree plantings, and then to also do some of the early structural pruning on those trees. Which is why in this class we first focus on basic tree biology and tree planting, then we're going to focus on pruning, and then we're going to focus on volunteer leadership. And so this is an awesome program. We will talk a little bit about some of the environmental aspects of this program as well. But they do a great work, but they're busy, right? They're coordinating these tree plantings, they're doing all that kind of stuff. And so this is where cooperative extension and kind of my role as a Master Gardener coordinator came into play, which I was like, hey, I can train volunteers. Like, I do that. If you guys need volunteers but you're having trouble with the time for training, let's do it, right? Like, I can do that for you. So we hold these trainings every year kind of to get you ready, right, for what would be peak tree planting season and especially peak tree keeper season. Because if you can imagine, if you're going to go out and plant 1,000+ trees every year and you're going to use volunteer labor to do that, it doesn't matter like how excited those people are. If you don't have lead volunteers who actually know what they're doing, like you're going to have a bunch of very lovingly planted trees that are upside down, right? Like you need people to kind of orient people to what's actually going on in the sites, and that's what the tree keepers really do. So the way that you'll be able to sign up as a tree keeper for these planting events is through each partner. So the City of Durham and Keep Durham Beautiful put out things, but mostly Keep Durham Beautiful will be putting out a newsletter every month with their upcoming opportunities, and you'll be able to sign up directly through them. So the training topics we'll cover are tree basics and planting. That's today, hopefully to kind of set a stage for what we'll be covering over the next 2 classes as well. picking the right tree and pruning. So next session we'll talk a little bit about some trees you might like, with kind of a focus on natives, because that's where we focus for the most part. And then finally, volunteer leadership. I will warn you, just find a seat wherever, that in between the second and third class, I will be sharing a link to a recording about the history of tree cover in Durham, and specifically how it intersects with redlining practices in Durham, so kind of a racial equity perspective. And I'd really like, that's kind of going to be your homework. So I'm just going to warn you that between session 2 and 3, there's going to be an hour-long lecture just for you to kind of watch and think about, so that we can talk a little bit about it in our third class. We all feeling good? Oriented? Okay. So in case you don't know me, because I'm going to be with you now for the next however many sessions, I just want to give a little bit of introduction to who I am. So, Ashley Troth, I have been here in Durham about 12 years now, a little bit over. I grew up, though, in Indiana. I grew up in central Indiana, and I spent all my summers, nobody feels that way about Indiana. Okay. So I grew up spending my summers going to a YMCA camp in Michigan, Camp Eberhart. Woo! So on the lake, learning about trees, learning about nature. Everybody else was having fun swimming. I particularly don't like lake weed on my feet, so I was learning about the plants and the trees and everything else, and I loved it. I ended up going to college at Indiana University, where I was able to get a degree in biology, and I did a lot of really cool field work on things like juncos and some different species of beetles and kind of all the weird stuff that you get into when it's a basic research program. I also, while I was there, worked as a volunteer coordinator for a local food pantry. So this is how you become this person, is when you're really into nature and you think volunteer coordination is fun. So I worked on dung beetles primarily for a while. I worked on the kind that bury dung, not the kind that roll dung. It's very contentious dung beetle wars, but I worked on dung beetles. That ended up taking me here to Duke for my graduate work, where I worked on a wildflower that grows out on the West Coast. We were really interested in understanding how genetic variation is maintained in natural populations. And when we think about native plants, that actually really comes into play, right? Because if all of your native plants are wonderful and beautiful and feeding the bees, but they're genetically identical, if one bad thing happens, you're in dire straits. And so, for example, Clay graciously dropped off a seed collection spot for us over on the side of the building, and that's to actually help collect acorns and other things from all of our native trees so that we can be growing up genetically diverse native plants, right? So this is something that's really important as we kind of move on. And finally, I ended up here about 6 years ago. I work with master gardeners. I work with everyone from kind of home landscapers up through landscape professionals and nursery people. So if you have, what's this bug? Or I'm vaguely thinking about native plants questions, right? Specific to general, I can answer those questions for you. And I'd love to hear from you. So what are we going to cover today? Basics of tree biology, just to kind of get us oriented. What do trees need? And so this is going to be a fair bit of actually soil basics. We spend so much time thinking about our tree, it lives in the soil. That's actually the thing that we really need to understand and get right. A little bit of planting 101, and then we are going to head outside and we are going to temporarily plant a tiny dogwood tree that is then going to go home with one of you. So it'll be great. So when we think about trees, there are any number of different things that we might be interested in. So there's the purely utilitarian. Sometimes you want a hedge, sometimes you want a screen, sometimes you want to block something off, right? There are reasons we plant like that. There's beauty, right? Beauty can come in any number of different ways. A lot of times it comes through different colors of leaves, but it can come from beautiful bark, right? We can get all season interest from our trees, and I'm not just talking crepe myrtles, right? This is a river birch, so we have native trees that will do this for us as well. Absolutely, we can get shade. Shade is massively important in urban environments because it really truly does lower the surrounding temperatures. Trees do other things as well, actually, that are just as important as shade, but shade is massively important. So if you're out walking in the summer and you're walking on a wide open street or you're walking on a really shady street, one of those is doable and one of them is not, right? In the middle of our summers. That wide open street, you just want to get off it. You want to be done with it. And we'll learn a little bit more about how that intersects with kind of people's lived experiences in that homework video. Trees can be beautiful for flowers, and they also provide habitat, they provide nectar, they provide pollen, they provide food. And finally, some trees are just cool, right? like honestly, right? So like we have over here bald cypress. These are wonderful because not only are they, needled, but drop their needles, which is great because it means that every year we get a couple of calls that are like, my tree is dying! Like, no, he's just going to sleep, it's fine. And they have these wonderful knees that they put up when they're in these high water environments, right? So there's all this kind of interesting tree biology going on, really interesting stuff, a lot we can learn. And I talked about it for a second, but trees truly serve as vital habitat for so many organisms. They are kind of the starting point for so many organisms' life cycles. If we think about, a lot of us might have seen or heard Doug Tallamy, right? So he wrote Nature's Best Hope. He wrote a number of other books that are kind of like, have been the thing for the last, 5+ years. And he talks a lot about what we can do to bring native plants back into our landscapes, even on a really small scale, to support habitat, right? To kind of reintroduce so many different plants and animals into our landscapes, even in urban environments. So Doug Tallamy made his name, right? He's actually like a professor of entomology, but he made his name writing books like this. Like he's really into trees, right? This was his follow-up book, The Nature of Oaks. And one of the reasons he's so interested, especially in oaks, is because our native oaks can support 500+ species of lepidopteran, so that's butterflies and moths, right? So they are kind of this really, really crucial host to so many different species. And that can be providing kind of a home base for those critters, providing the leaf litter that they actually overwinter in, providing food that they eat, providing all of these different things. So a lot of us might be gardeners. These pictures are both from J.C. Ralston Arboretum. And for those of us who are gardeners, this is something we might understand a little bit better, right? These are their native color field trials. It's a bunch of annuals and perennials out in a field, and they see how they do for a year, right? And a lot of us who are gardeners are like, yeah, I can grow like flowers. I can grow shrubs. But we see something like a tree and we're like, I don't know. It's a huge living statue, I'm not really sure. Like I need extra help, right? And they're different, but they're also not that different, right? And a lot of what you take and a lot of what you know about growing smaller plants, you can apply to trees. There's some special tricks along the way because like, if you make a mistake, it might take them 200 years to show it. Don't worry, that's not your problem at that point. But really, a lot of this, if you know a little bit about plants, you can figure out trees pretty easily. So let's take a step back and think about plants though for a second. So what makes plants special? It's really that they are able to use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, right? The process of photosynthesis. This is what makes plants special. It's what makes them the basis of basically all terrestrial food webs, all land-based food webs. So for the kind of more technical people who want to see it, right, what does that actually look like? You're going to take carbon dioxide and water, and using the energy of the sun, you're going to create sugars and oxygen, right? The plants then are able to use that sugar right there to build structures, to survive, to reproduce, to defend themselves, right? Like that is the energy they use to do everything. And the amazing thing about that is we'll talk a lot about soil and the nutrients it can provide and how it provides like habitat for the trees. But the vast majority of what the trees are using to build their bodies, even our massive willow oaks, is carbon dioxide. They're pulling it from the air, right? They're literally pulling that carbon out of the air and they're sequestering it in their bodies. And so if we even think about, right, the ability of a big tree over time to sequester carbon, it's pretty impressive. Okay, if you learn nothing else from these classes, plant cells don't move. This is like the thing I need you to take home. As animals, we are very used to the idea that like if I cut myself or if something happens in my body, other cells will move in to help or other things will come to help, right? Plant cells do not move. What does that mean? Trees can only add cells in two ways. They can add them in what we call the primary way, which is to the ends, right? If you think about a branch getting longer, that's because cells are being added to the end, right? And if you think about the secondary way, that's what we would consider wider, right? Why does a tree get wider as it grows, right? It starts out tiny like this, and then by the time it's big, it's like this. And that's because cells were added to the outside. There is never a moment when two cells are next to each other and a cell can be put in between. It's just impossible. It can't be done, right? Plant cells don't move. So kind of the classic example you'll see of this is if you think about people kind of being terrible in carving their initials in trees, it will always be at the exact same height in the exact same place. It won't move up, it won't stretch out, nothing like that will really happen too much, right? It will be in that place. So when we think about secondary, right, we think about cells being added kind of on the outer sense. And one of the important things about trees, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second, but just to introduce the idea, is that that means that as the tree kind of gets wider, that central core, which used to be the outside, right, but more cells were added outside, it becomes the heartwood, and oftentimes it actually is structural, but if it starts to decay or break down a little bit, it's actually okay, because it's not living tissue anymore. All of the really important living tissue is right around the outside of the tree, right under the bark. So oftentimes when we have big mature trees in our landscape, they might have a crack in the middle, and we see that they're open on the inside, or rotted on the inside, and everyone's like, it's gonna fall, it's rotten, it's terrible. And I'd be like, get an arborist to actually do an assessment, because that's also just a natural part of the life cycle of a mature tree, is that the center does start kind of giving out over time, because it's not living tissue in the same way. This picture over here we're going to go into in more detail, but again, this is a growing tip, so it's like the tip of a root, or the tip of a branch. And you have all these special cells right at that very tip that allow more cells to be added. But you can't ever go back and like add cells right here, right? You can only ever add to the very tip. So those places where plants can add cells as they're lengthening, that primary growth, those are called meristems. They're going to be at the tips of roots and shoots. We think of, oftentimes you hear branches called shoots. And also they're going to be secondary ones kind of along the stems. And so what happens there is that right here, this is the very tip of a shoot, right? The very tip of a branch. And this is actually a really specialized population of stem cell-like cells that are able to differentiate and add more cells. And it kind of just keeps getting pushed out as it does that. Right here, you also have little populations of those stem cells that can do the same thing, right? So what does that actually mean practically? That asterisk is for me to remind you, otherwise I won't do this, is that what we're talking about here is how plants can kind of grow and they can add to the tips and also at these nodes and branches. But what's really important to remember is that narrow-leaved evergreens, right? So some of our like evergreens that have needles and that kind of stuff, they don't always have these buds. So what I'm about to tell you in a second doesn't apply to them. This is why when you prune like a pine tree, it just looks terrible. And like it's not gonna grow out of it, because it doesn't have this tissue a lot of the time. It only grows from the very tip. It can't grow from the side. So like if you have a pine tree and you decide you're just gonna limb it up a little bit, and then you think you limbed it up too far, that's it, right? You're done, right? So this might be a kind of a way of looking at this that we're more familiar with, right? So if you think about a shoot, you've got that little meristem right up here at the very tip, right? That's where the plant is going to be growing longer like this. And then you have the little populations of stem cells, the little side meristems here. We call them, you'd also sometimes hear them called buds, right?
Like an tomato plant.
Like in a tomato plant, right? Yeah, you got buds. And so there are different types of buds, right? There's like the bud that you think of that grows into a flower. But there's also the bud that exists right down here at the stem, right? So if I cut this plant right here, just what would happen?
Grow from those two nodes.
These two would then grow out, okay? Because there are these little populations that can do that. But if I cut it right here, you'd have to go all the way back down to this lower bud to get that growth, right? Like you're not going to have something grow out of right here, right? It has to come from one of these special populations of cells. That becomes really important for pruning, so I'm just kind of laying some breadcrumbs, right? So a little bit more Tree Anatomy 101, the vascular system. This is really important to understand. The vascular system of the plant is really the way that nutrients and water are transported. So first we have the xylem. The xylem transports water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves, predominantly, right? Spring and fall, things get a little bit squirrely and sometimes nutrients start flowing in directions you wouldn't expect, but for the most part, you're pulling nutrients from the roots to the leaves. Phloem, on the other hand, I always think of like phloem and food, like phloem is like the sugars, transports sugars from the leaves to the rest of the plant. Because remember, photosynthesis is how you produce the sugars. Photosynthesis only happens in green tissue. And so you're going to make all the sugars out here, but then you need to get them to the roots and to every place else, right, to build all those structures. So phloem does that sort of transport. In trees, the way that this is organized is actually, this is kind of cool. You have the xylem is here, right? See these little dark half circles kind of all the way around? It's organized around the outside. The phloem then is actually this corresponding green circle right here. To those of you that are colorblind, I'm sorry. So this whole bundle here is kind of a vascular tissue bundle. And the interface between the two of them is something we call the cambium. So if you go out to a tree and you take a branch and you scrape it with your nail, just to get through that brown bark, you're going to see a bright green layer, hopefully, if it's alive and doing well. That's the cambium, okay? And the reason that matters is that because if you can imagine all that vascular tissue, all that xylem and phloem, right, transporting all the vital stuff, is right here at the surface, right? I can scrape down to it with my fingernail. And the moment I scrape through it, the moment I break that cambium layer, I've severed transport. What's above it and below it can no longer communicate in that spot, right? So if you've ever heard of a tree being girdled, right, that's what happens when you hit the tree all around with the weed whacker, or some enterprising critter comes and chews it all the way around, and it disconnects. It goes through the cambium all the way around the tree. Top and above and below that damage can no longer communicate, can no longer transport. Everything above will die, right? So even though the trees seem so big and mighty, you have to do about an inch of damage all the way around, and you're in real trouble, right? So they're pretty delicate that way. And the one extra thing I want to add about kind of all this water transport, so all this water coming up from the roots to the leaves, is that this is actually really, really important for what trees do for us in especially urban environments. So this movement of water from the roots up is called transpiration. And so basically all of this water gets pulled up out through the leaves, and it's like their version of sweating. So you know how when you sweat, you have water, right? You have your sweat, and then it evaporates off and you feel cooler. The same thing happens, but it happens on a massive scale. All the energy that goes into evaporating that water off the leaves, that energy then doesn't heat the surrounding environment anymore. It's been used in that process. So it cools the plant and it cools the surrounding area. So we always think of trees as being essential for shade, which is very true, but it's actually this cooling effect of transpiration as well. It does require adequate soil moisture, so if your soil's bone dry, this doesn't work, right? There's no water to pull up. But if your soil's wet, it can do this process, it can transpire. And a large oak tree can transpire something like 40,000 gallons per year, right? Think about you sweating on your own little scale. Some of us, it doesn't feel like a little scale, but versus 40,000 gallons a year per large mature oak. Massively cooling urban, especially environments, right? This is why trees can be thought of as almost like more urban infrastructure, right? We need city lights to light our way. We need trees to cool the environment. Yeah.
What about those days of really high humidity, but you have dry soil?
God bless North Carolina. But
Which we seem to be experiencing.
yeah, and that can be pretty hard. I mean,
What happens to the tree when
they
you
get super stressed.
distressed? Yeah.
Yeah, because high humidity probably means high heat, so they're still trying to do that process, but it's not getting sucked off quite the right way.
Yeah.
You know, I would say they're probably just baseline stress because the soil is dry.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good. Yeah. Okay. So with annual growth on trees, this goes back to this idea a little bit of secondary growth, right? That widening growth where they're adding rings to the outside. Each little ring on a tree is the previous year's cambium, right? It's kind of where the cambium was, and then it moves out, and then it moves out, and then it moves out. So something you'll see is that typically, like in really, really good years, a ring might be a little bit wider. In really, really lean years, a ring might be narrower, so they can actually look back into an old tree's rings to understand the environment that it experienced. But again, all of that really crucial really crucial tissue is right here out at the very edges. And that dark in the middle, that's the heartwood. That's where the tree can actually, it's just basically dead, right? It does some, but it really doesn't do much. It might start rotting out on a tree. That can create habitat. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tree is weak or anything's wrong with it. Okay. So given what we know about trees and plants in general, that plant cells don't move, and that they've got all of this vascular tissue transporting things up and down all the time, you might wonder, like, how does a tree protect itself, right? Because if there is damage, and it's just whipping water and nutrients up and down all the time, right? That could also be used for bacteria. That could be used for fungus. That could be used for any other thing, right? It's just moving all of this stuff all the time. So a tree is essentially a long tube, right? With all that vascular tissue. So they need a way to seal off the wound. They can't heal it the way we traditionally would. They do something we call compartmentalization of decay. And this is like, sometimes you might see this referred to as code it, compartmentalization of decay in trees. But it's just one of those things that, like, if you're an arborist, you start talking about compartmentalization of decay, whew, you will impress them, don't you worry. So thinking about how this works, it happens really the same way in a series of steps. So first you have the injury to the tree, right? So say we're right here and something happened, right? Either a branch was cut off or there was a serious injury that broke through the bark. The first thing the tree does is it creates a wall basically above and below. It plugs up the xylem and the phloem above and below as best it can to make sure that things aren't just being transported like bacteria, fungus, other spores up and down, right? Obviously it doesn't plug all of it because it would starve itself up here, right? But it plugs enough that it thinks it's kind of held it in place. The next wall that forms is actually inside. It starts kind of hardening off this tissue to prevent spread of decay. This is not a fast process, right? It's doing this as best it can, but it's a tree, right? Like, it does things on its own time scale. The third wall is, if you imagine looking down a tree, it's kind of like the cross sections, right? So now you've blocked it from moving up or down, you've blocked it from moving back, now you're trying to block it from moving side to side, right? Any decay that might have been introduced. And finally, the last wall is actually the exterior. And so we'll talk in our pruning class about what you can do to make good cuts to make this as easy as possible for the tree, right? Bad cuts are very hard for a tree to ever seal on the outside. Good cuts at the right place, and it has a much easier time doing it. And this is not just a conceptual thing, right? So this is an example of a tree where it was damaged here, right? This long running damage, and when they cut that tree down, they were able to find, right? So the first wall would have been somewhere like here, right? Because it's plugging vasculature. The second wall would have been back here, but it wasn't able to get it all the way, so it actually was able to spread back out. Third walls, right? We're trying to contain it as best it could and ended up having to do it in both directions. And then it was never able to really fully close that, right? You still see damage and you still see, there's a little bit of an opening there, but I'm sure that there are spots in there that are not quite right. And this is probably some of the damage that really did harm to this tree. So what we say is people heal, trees seal, okay? They're just like doing their best to internally seal off a damaged area. Which can also be why you can see decay in a tree, and it might be a problem, it might not. Because there might be decay, but it's sealed that section off. And so even though it's not great, it doesn't necessarily mean the end of that tree, right? If it did its job correctly. All right, moving on to some of the essential stuff. Tree 101, roots. So I always liked the description of a tree as being like a wine glass on a dinner plate, right? The root area can be quite large. Really, you might have heard like, oh, the tree's roots just go out to the drip line, so kind of as wide as the canopy is, they can go out further if the tree is happy. So the absorbing roots are in the top 12 inches of soil. Those are absolutely essential. That's how the tree picks up all of its nutrients. Those are really, really important. They're kind of really foundational for the tree's growth. Lateral roots go out and stabilize. These are kind of what we consider structural roots. And then sinker roots go down, but often not that deep. So I think we've all probably, unfortunately, seen one of our big willow oaks tipped over, and you're always just shocked, right? Because there's like, depth-wise, no root tissue there. It's all out to the sides. And that's because they can typically be successful really stabilizing themselves that way. And what they're really focused on is actually growing the absorbing roots, which are tiny roots that might even be as thin as a hair. This matters because when we think about things like street tree planting, if those absorbing roots, right, are trying to go under a street, they're not going to pick up any nutrients that way. And so a lot of times we try to be really specific with the varieties we pick for street tree planting, and Keep Durham Beautiful and the City of Durham do a great job with this, to find trees that can kind of overcome having maybe not as much area for their roots as they would really like.
Is there going to be any variation in a single species? So I assume there's variation, like one tree will do deeper sinker roots versus another species, but within the same species, depending on soil conditions, will that change?
Absolutely. Yeah, it will absolutely change. The question was, is there variability within a single species on how a tree will perform? And based on soil conditions, 100%, right? Because if you think about a tree like this that wants to have these wide roots out this way, but it's hitting a hindrance here, it's just not going to grow as much in that direction. Because they really grow in response to nutrient gradients, right? So they go the direction that it looks good,
Actually, what is a taproot? I hear oak trees have long taproots.
Yeah.
And I have one that's 4 years old, and I know if I don't, it's not in a good place. So can I move it to another place, or is it too late?
It could be hard. Some species have taproots and some species don't.
What is a taproot?
A taproot is, it's a sinker root. It goes down deeper. It tends to just be, it is like that tree throws it down real quick and it like anchors itself in really hard. So pawpaws also have taproots that can make them very hard to transplant. I think certain pines do. I can't tell you a species by species breakdown, I'm not gonna lie. That was like the extent of my party tricks on who has
But
taproots.
that's also with plants too,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So like
Certain plants and
pokeweed. Pokeweed has a taproot. Anytime you try to pull up dock or dandelion or a carrot is a taproot.
That's it, okay.
Yeah. What is the other one I'm thinking of? It doesn't matter.
If you want to transplant one, if you damage the taproot, will that damage make it impossible to transplant, or
It won't make it impossible, it'll make it very hard.
make it hard? Okay.
Those plants want to be planted as young as possible
Yeah, the squirrel.
and not moved. Yeah, if the squirrel can do it, that's great. Did you have?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a white oak in my yard. If there is damage to an absorbing root, I think the one that I have is like the size of a thigh, and it's got, I don't know, it almost just looks like something just chopped right into it. Does that compartmentalize the same way that the top part of the tree would? Okay.
Yeah, and so anything that's, the absorbing roots are very, very fine. They're almost like hair. So what you're thinking about is more like a lateral root, probably. And they will seal themselves off as best as possible. They'll do the best they can. And typically there are enough lateral roots around that if you only hit a small number of them, or if you only hit them a little bit, kind of like spread out evenly, I wouldn't be as worried. Right? It's the sort of thing where like when someone comes in and they do construction and they dig a trench right next to the tree, and you're like, wow, you cut all the roots on that one side, so now I'd be worried about that tree kind of moving forward. Yeah. Whereas if they like hit random roots around it, I'm not as worried in a weird way.
Yeah, I was just worried it's going to introduce some kind of rot.
It could.
Okay, well, that's not great.
But I mean, you and I, we get weird assaults to our immune system all the time, right? And we make it through. So I would say keep an eye on it, but for the most part, a good, healthy plant should be able to get through the minor inconveniences of being a tree, Oh, this picture. Okay, so because those absorbing roots are so high, right? They're in the top 12 inches, if not even just the top couple of inches. It means that you do want to be careful around trees. So I was out on a walk and I noticed these people had taken out their grass, I think to protect their trees, and had been very careful about it. They'd taken out their grass, tilled the area, and then mulched. And I think it was for the trees, but when they tilled, I think the trees are still alive. This has been a couple years, and I've seen them and they're still alive, but I would just say that it means I'd be very careful with doing things like disturbing the soil too much around trees, right? Am I telling you not to plant a shrub or a flower? No. I'm telling you to not massively disrupt the top couple inches around a tree, because that's where so many of its important roots are.
Would have been nicer to like sort of aerate that area.
Or even, I mean, if the trees are doing okay, I mean, what you could do is you could basically put down newspaper or something else like that to block the plants underneath that you're trying to kill. Mulch on top of that with like an arborist wood chip or whatever you have. And then slowly, as that paper and then the wood chips break down, it moves down into the soil actually, and it helps decompact it. Yeah.
How far out do the absorbing roots go? You're saying they're in the top 12 inches, but are they, they're the full?
I would go at least to the drip line, and I would assume that on a healthy plant they're going to go a little bit wider than that. Yeah. This is not to say like never touch anything around a tree. Just be thoughtful when you're doing it, and maybe don't like do everything all at once, right? And so, thinking just a little bit more about those roots, many trees do have fungal relationships where they have mycorrhizae that extend the reach of those tree roots. And so the way that works is really, it's a partnership between the fungus and the tree, where the tree is basically feeding the fungus carbohydrates, the sugars it produces, and the fungus is in exchange helping it with water and nutrient uptake. And so this is actually one of the reasons, like sidebar, but it's really good to have both trees and shrubs and perennials and other plants in your yard to kind of have a mix of everything, is because trees are more prone to having fungal relationships, whereas a lot of like perennials are more prone, and especially into like the grasses, are more prone to having bacterial relationships. And so when you have both of them together, you're feeding the fungus and the bacteria. You're feeding everything in the soil, and the more diversity you can have, the better. So if we look at, like, this is a great picture of a little pine sapling, and its roots actually go about this far, and this is all just the mycorrhizal relationships, really extending it out. There is some research that's shown that these fungal relationships can connect between trees, but I think I read a really interesting article about how in our exuberance to talk about trees talking and sharing with each other and like that vision of the world that we all wanted to be true, people might have overstated how much trees might be sharing through these relationships, but it's a really active field of study to understand kind of if trees are connected underground by fungus, like what does that mean, and what does that mean for how they grow and how they live. So what do trees need? So almost all trees want even water, if they could have their druthers. A lot of them can survive with something else, but they like even water. Low sunlight exposure for the soil. Ample space above and below ground. High biological activity in the soil. And a moderate organic content in the soil, right? So a lot of what we'll talk about here is actually it's about soil, right? It's about what that tree is growing in. So we're going to transition now to talking a little bit just about soil, kind of a primer on soil. So what does soil do? A decent soil will provide plants water, nutrients, oxygen, and anchorage, right? It'll be an anchor point for that plant. If you have a really good soil, it can manage water flow, which I think we all can appreciate right now. Breaks down waste and other pollutants, which is crazy but true. Provides habitat, and it reduces water and nutrient inputs. So if you have a good, healthy soil, you probably don't need to be using much fertilizer, especially for trees, and you actually don't even probably need to be watering much, except for in times of really severe drought, right? The soil will take care of almost all of this for you. We're going to go through a little bit of soil basics. We're going to talk about some of the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of soil. So, you're not going to know everything, but you're going to know enough to be dangerous, which is good. So the ideal soil makeup, and I say ideal I always want to put in quotes, right? Like, a cactus doesn't need the same thing as like a pear tree, right? Different plants want different things, but we can kind of think about this as a base state. The ideal soil makeup, you can actually think of it as about half space and half stuff, right? So the space aspect of it is the open space between the stuff, and you want about half of that full of water and half of it full of air. If you have all of it full of water, the tree drowns. If you have all of it full of air, the tree has no water, right? You want a little bit of both. The tree roots do need to be able to take oxygen, they can't be entirely underwater. For stuff, you want the majority of that to be mineral, right? Actually, like broken down rocks, essentially, right? Clay, sand, and silt. And you want about 5% of it to be organic. This is why we don't plant in straight compost, right? Planting in straight compost would be like if all of this half was organic. But that mineral component is actually really, really, really essential for forming a soil, forming a long-term soil that doesn't just break down and disappear over time. I think of any of us who have ever grown things in raised beds and you just watch your soil level go down every year, that's your organic matter breaking down, right? And so to kind of see that in a slightly different way, right? Here's a picture of that soil where you have all of this space, what we might call pores. Some of it's going to be filled with air, some of it's going to be filled with water. And then this is the stuff, right? It's the sand, silt, and clay, and organic matter together. So for that mineral portion, the mineral particle sizes that really make up a soil, like I said, are sand, silt, and clay. If you think about, and this is kind of relatively what their sizes are like, you can think of sand as being like a beach ball, silt as being more like a tennis ball, and clay as being more like a grain of rice. So it's a different shape and it's a really different size. And if you think about if you have a bunch of beach balls and you try to pour water through them, it just runs right through, right? If you had the same amount of rice and you tried to pour water through it, you're never getting all your water back out, right? Like it's, right, like that you'll get some after a while and there will still be water in that rice. And I think we all know that from our clays, right? They get very waterlogged. They also get very dry, which is frustrating. So for super visual people, this is what sand looks like just with a regular camera. This is what clay looks like under a microscope, right? It's flatter, it's not round the same way, it stacks really tightly. And so a lot of us can get frustrated with our clays. Like we just are like, ugh, it's just clay, I can't grow anything here, it's just clay. But our clay is actually really phenomenal because of its size. So the way that clay really impacts soil is mostly through soil chemistry. So if you think about it, if I have a grain of sand, imagine this is a grain of sand, right? That's what they all look like. It has so much surface area, right? If I instead break it down into smaller parts, I have more surface area, right? Like I have more on the outside. And what that matters is because all over a clay particle, a tiny clay particle or a bigger sand particle, all on the outside are negative charges, right? That's just a thing. I'm sharing that fact with you. All over is negative charges. And those negative charges are so important because a lot of our nutrients in the soil that we want exist with a positive charge. You might have heard this before, cation exchange capacity, the CEC of your soil. So our clay soils have all these negative charges, and because they're tiny, they have a lot of surface area, so they have a lot of negative charge. And these nutrients in the soil will glom onto those negative charges, and the clay will hold it, and they become these little nutrient bombs. They hold it just tightly enough so that those nutrients don't wash away, and just loose enough that the plants can pull them off basically in water. Okay? Our clays, if you ask me, do you want to start with a clay soil or a sandy soil? I'll be like, clay soil any day. I don't want to mess with that sandy soil because I'm just going to be pouring nutrients into it forever. Right, so why does this matter? It matters, our clay soils, for water permeation and retention. So how well does water get into the soil? And then how well does it stay in the soil? For aeration, kind of the flip side of that coin, right? Nutrient supply and availability, and soil strength. So how hard is it? It's hard to build on clay, it's harder to build on sand, right? So for just a real comparison of those two, This is actually a local clay soil. This is not local, but it's a North Carolina sandy soil. Clay soils have high nutrient holding capacity. It's the best thing about them. They also have high water holding capacity. Right? We have all watched a plant drown or have its roots rot out from under them because it was too much water. God bless you. The annoying thing about that is that also once it dries out, it takes a long time to re-wet our clays. So they can be kind of a bear to work with. They're often poorly aerated, and the way you can tell clay is it feels slippery to the touch. I mean, also you just get it caked on your boots like you know you're in clay. Sandy soils have low organic matter and low native fertility, right? They don't hold nutrients particularly well. They also don't hold water well, right? Imagine spilling a drink on the beach, it's gone. They're well aerated and they feel gritty. So I always like sharing this just because I'm always curious. That's all well and good. Why do we have clay soils here? North Carolina doesn't all have clay soils. It has a little bit of everything. So I share this just so you can understand why you're dealing with what you're dealing with. So quick North Carolina soil history break. That's our state, right? We have the mountains, the Piedmont, and kind of Sand Hills Coast, kind of all that stuff out east that's really nice to visit, right? The mountains actually formed many times, starting about 1.2 billion years ago up to about 300 million years ago. The Appalachians rose and fell and rose and fell and rose and fell. They were, at a time, the highest mountains in the world. They are not anymore, right? We think of them as pretty gentle mountains. And that was kind of all that process of rising and falling. The Piedmont was added about 300 million years ago. There's some idea that actually the Piedmont originally existed as almost like a volcanic atoll, right? That's a volcanic formed island, like Japan, and crashed into this area, and that's some of the basis of those soils, so that early formation. And then finally, all these sandy areas were deposited millions to about 65 million years ago, right? And so that's when the ocean rises and falls and rises and falls, and every time it does it, it deposits sands, okay? So part of what happened here is that as the Appalachians were rising and falling, that material went somewhere, and at the same time, there was a lot of plate tectonic activity that was actually ripping open a lot of areas kind of on the East Coast. So deep basins were forming as these tectonic plates were shifting against each other. You can kind of think of them as like stretch marks, right? They're like the stretch marks of the earth kind of moving and shifting. And so all these little red areas are these deep basins. And so you might have heard of this called the Triassic Basin that we're in. That's what that is. So as the Appalachians eroded and other things happened, all that mixed material is moving down. It has to go somewhere, right? If you have the tallest mountains in the world, they have to go somewhere. And a lot of it is going to fill in these stretch marks. And so what happens is that means in this area, a lot of the clay kind of washed in. But it's also why if you go to visit a farm in the northern part of the county, a lot of them have really excellent rock work. And those are rocks they pulled out of their fields. They are big boulders that they're pulling out of their fields. And you might find that even in your own yard. And it's because all this material is kind of washing in, and the clay is suspended for the longest time in the water because it's so fine. But the boulders wash in too. People will randomly have sandy patches in their yard because it's all this different material washing in together. Some parts of the county also have what we call diabase. So this is, I think, like Penny's Bend has this, where the soils are completely different because they have a totally different thing going on, and you have these really strange soils and totally unique plant communities. But for the most part, what you're left with in this area is clay soils.
What's it called in Penny's Bend?
Diabase. So you'll hear it called diabase dikes, and they're these crazy rock formations that are way more basic than the surrounding acidic soils, and so you have completely unique plant communities that can exist there.
Ashley, what is the gray clay soil? How does that relate? Because I know that's supposed to be nutrient poor.
So gray clay soils are what happens when red is oxidation, gray is in reduction, not enough oxygen. So if you have a red clay soil or other soils that kind of have a different makeup, but they're underwater for too long and they don't have access to oxygen, they start graying.
Yes.
And so having these long-term gray soils, to me, tells me that you're waterlogged and there's other things going on. So across the state, this leaves this really, really interesting soil history that is completely unique. I'll share this article because it's just like one man's journey to understand the soils of North Carolina. It's totally charming. So in the mountains, you have a totally different soil origin and you have cooler weather, so you have more organic matter. Here we have our red clays. Here you have the sands that are deposited, and then further out you actually have high organic matter soils as well because it's being deposited from oceanic deposits, basically. So that all sounds good, but this, right, is the inner. This is what our soils were for a long time. Most of us do not feel like we're gardening in this, right? Like that's not our experience. We're not trying to grow trees in this, right? And that's because of the history of agriculture in the area. We have a long-running history of agriculture. We have tobacco, we have cotton, we have other things that were grown here. You know, it was really important for our economy. But the downside to that is, you know, they didn't know everything about soil health that we know. We don't know everything that 100 years from now is going to know about soil health, right? Mistakes were made. And what was lost through a lot of this farming was the organic matter. And what we're left with is that red clay soil, right? This sort of action. The other reason this happens a lot in this area is because to construct homes, buildings, anything else like that, the developers are not removing the topsoil out of spite, right? It might feel that way, but they're not. They're doing it so that they can build. They can build on clay. They can't build on that organic matter because just like your raised bed, it's all going to disappear, right? They need to be on stronger stuff. Yes, they should leave the topsoil on site and then respread it. That would be great. That's a thing to talk about with development ordinances. But you have all of this going on. This is what so many of us are moving into, what so many of us are living in. They might roll out some sod, call it a day, right? But there's no topsoil here. And why that's really important is that this red soil that we're looking at, it's almost not even soil. Soil is the dark stuff at the top where there's biological activity and where plants can grow. This is subsoil, right? This is the stuff that is supposed to be mixed with organic material to create a good, healthy living soil, right? So we're trying to grow trees and other plants in a layer that doesn't really support life. It needs more. So what are we left with in the Piedmont? Typical Piedmont soil is about 16% pore space, 82% mineral, and 2% organic. As a reminder, we wanted 50, we got 16, right? Highly compacted soils that have a hard time letting roots through. Yeah.
If you were to, like, you know, in your front yard with that compacted subsoil, even if you were to spread topsoil on it, would you get kind of a plow pan effect? Like, would that just not mix until, like, you know, years and years down the road?
You definitely can. So the plow pan effect is when it's been so compacted that even if you tried, there's a layer, you know, maybe however many inches down that's just like water's not getting through it. Like you're farming in a bathtub or you're growing in a bathtub, right? That's the sort of situation where we sometimes consider tilling. I don't really like tilling for the most part, but that's where you might break it up. If you had organic matter, I mean, if you're willing to wait like 50 years, like it'll get there and it'll like loosen it up. But yeah, it's where you might want to consider breaking it up. So we have highly compacted soils that are generally acidic with little organic matter. They are acidic for just reasons of their soil formation, things that are chemically true about them. I don't want to go into the details of it too much, but know that we have acidic soils. And the reason that matters is because the soil pH affects nutrient availability. So this is a really cool graph. So I love this figure. What this figure is showing is we have pH here along the bottom, and then each bar is a plant nutrient, and where it's green, it is very available to the plant at that pH. Where it's yellow, it's less available. Where it's red, it doesn't matter how much is there, the plant has trouble seeing it. It's not going to be in the right form for the plant to uptake, okay?
So does that mean things like blueberries, azaleas, they prefer iron, manganese, they prefer these, or like they have a high need for those particular
That's a great
nutrients?
question. I don't know exactly.
Okay.
What I always assume, that's a great question. So we have acid-loving plants, right? And so I always assumed that this is like an ideal soil, right? In that each plant's distribution might be a little bit different, but this is kind of an average of a bunch of plants. But it also might be that certain plants want things more. That's a good question. I'll look into that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Before we move on from this, do you dislike the concept of tilling because it disrupts like existing root structures, or is there something else? Like if you were starting with a totally plain yard and you weren't worried about disrupting roots because there's literally nothing growing there, would that be okay, or is there something off that way?
I mean, follow your heart. Like it's okay. I'm not here to tell you what you're doing is not okay.
No, this is just
But yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I don't like tilling because
soil
it
biology?
like what?
Is it disrupting the soil
It
biology?
disrupts the soil biology, right? Soil microbes want to be in the soil. They don't want to be exposed to the sun, right? So any soil biology I have, I'm going to massively disrupt with tilling. If there's any soil structure there, right, which is how all those particles come together and form, it's going to disrupt that. It's going to disrupt roots, but in this hypothetical, we don't have that. So I would say if you have a situation that's really bad and you know there's heavy compaction and there was machinery on site, there was blah, 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 maybe you till once. But for me personally, I would be trying to think about how I could not till if I didn't have to. Yeah.
Do you measure the soil levels as well, or not so much?
Not as much. Yeah. I don't think the state's soil lab even does that. I have to think about that. I don't know if that's true or not. Okay, so on this one, typically something we really like is to be in the 6 to 6.5 range because so many of the plant nutrients are more or less available in that range. But a lot of our native soils are closer to 4.5 to 5.5. This is why sometimes you might hear from us at Extension even, you might want to lime your soils. For trees, I wouldn't mess with that for the most part. Luckily, a lot of our native trees like a slightly acidic soil, right? Nobody was liming trees 100,000 years ago, right? Like, they evolved to handle slightly more acidic soils, so you're fine. You can alter the soil to support a plant, but it will always go back to what it was, pH-wise. So I would instead tell you to pick a different plant, right? Pick something that's going to work with what you've got. I work for Extension, so I have to say this. We do offer soil testing through the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. We will even take it to Raleigh for you from April through Thanksgiving. It's for free. Rest of the year it's $4, and we ask you to get there on your own steam. We have supplies in the cabinet on the north side of the building over there. You'll see it when we go outside. This allows you to test the pH and the nutrient levels of your soil. It's kind of a helpful thing just to make sure. One of the reasons it can be especially helpful in urban environments or where there's recent construction is that sometimes in urban environments you run into high pH soils because of things like concrete and cement. Weird things that you wouldn't expect. So it can be helpful to double check. Okay. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit, but we're still okay on time. So we've talked a lot about sand, silt, and clay. We've talked about soil chemistry. Now we're kind of switching over into the biology of soil. So soil structure is how the soil particles group together into larger aggregates, right? Like you don't go out there and just have 100 pieces of sand, 100 pieces of salt, 100 pieces of clay. They gather together, right? And so this is soil with a really good structure, right? When it was pulled up, it stayed together. It held itself together. That's because there are actually glues, organic glues, holding it together from everything that's alive in it. It's got that nice dark color, right? It doesn't just look like a pile of sand or a pile of clay. The more organic matter you have, the better your structure will be.
To a point.
To a point. Yeah, we say strive for 5%, you guys. Everybody is tempted to fill their raised beds with like just compost. Don't do it. I would never go more than like 75%. I would do like 75% soil to 25% compost, right? You want more organic matter to a point. Organic matter helps with compaction. It allows for better water infiltration, better water movement, and improved nutrient availability. And that's because organic matter in its most common form in the soil is smaller than clay. So it has a higher cation exchange capacity, it can hold more nutrients, and it can get between those clay particles and space them out, right? And it's the stuff that's feeding the microbes of the soil. They're living on organic matter, they're not living on clay. As the soil gets better, you will get more organisms in the soil. right? So sometimes you can see where you can buy mycorrhizae or you can buy things to add to the soil. If you have good organic matter in your soil, it will come of its own accord. And if you don't have good organic matter, no one's going to stay, right? More organisms help plant growth and further improve soil structure. So the critters crawling through the soil open it up, create pore space, create aeration, allow water in. All the microbes are helping to get nutrients into plant available forms. Soil has a very complex food web when it's healthy. So don't worry about, you're not just allowing a bunch of pests in, right? People are like, oh, a bunch of critters in my soil, like, oh, it's a bunch of pests. No. If you have a complex food web, it becomes balanced, right? What makes a weed in many cases? A weed is a plant that does really well in disturbance, where the environment's not what it should be, right? When you have a strong diversity of plants, it's harder for weeds to really take off because they can fight the weeds back better, right? Same with the soil food web. When it's strong, when it's healthy, when it's complex, it's in balance, you don't tend to get the same amount of problems. And one of the cool things is that adding trees and other plants makes the soil even healthier. One of the best things you can do for soil is to always have living roots in it. And that's because living roots are shedding sugars, they're shedding other things all the time that feed the microbes, feed the critters in the soil. Also, they act basically as biological glues that help that aggregation, that help that soil structure. So the best thing you can do for your garden, really, is to always have living roots in the soil, always be feeding the soil and everything that's living in it. All right. So we're gonna do just a little bit of planting 101, but my goal is to be outside pretty soon, so we have time to kind of look at what we're doing. Are we all feeling okay? Yeah.
One last question on that.
Yeah.
Does that extend to the idea that if you've got a lot of weeds in the open space, that you want to convert and plant desirable stuff rather than pulling them up, that you just cut off so that their roots and all the stuff in the soil stays in the soil?
Depends on what they are, right? A lot of them will grow through. So if I have a lot of weeds in a space, I have two different answers. If I have a bunch of invasive weeds, right? Like if I'm looking at a field of like Japanese stiltgrass and wisteria, I would actually consider for myself doing an herbicide treatment to kill everything, because I don't want to mess with it. I want it gone. I want it dead. And the ecological impact of that herbicide treatment is less than the ecological impact of having a yard full of invasive weeds. That's one way you can do it, but that's me, you know. The other thing you can do is I do recommend that thing where you're covering with cardboard or newspaper or something like that, and then covering with mulch over that, because you're going to keep all that organic matter there, but the plants can't go through it. The gnarlier it is, the heavier duty your like paper product is going to have to be, right? Like a really invasive, gnarly weed doesn't care about newspaper, but like cardboard might stop him. So that's kind of how I do it. But if you can leave roots to rot in the ground, that's always good. Yeah.
How much organic matter would you put on top of it actually, like cardboard?
So, I mean, like I just put it in a bed this weekend and I knew I had some stuff there, but I wasn't too worried about it. And so I did a couple layers of newspaper. If I was really worried, I might be breaking down cardboard boxes and putting it there. Just make sure you take all the tape off, because otherwise it's just a train wreck. And then you want to put, you know, a couple inches of, yeah, just for that first year, just to really kind of lock it in. Yeah, you don't want like your cardboard blown away.
Can I mix clay, wood chips, and some compost?
You can, and so if you're going to use wood chips, so you can always actually apply things on top and it will break down and get into the soil, but it might take a year or two. If you want to do it faster, you can certainly mix compost into the top couple inches and that can really help. If you're going to use wood chips, just make sure they're aged. You can absolutely use unaged arborist wood chips as a mulch that you only apply on top. Old research said not to do that. Current research says that's fine. But you don't want to mix unaged chips into the soil, because then you can have some problems with nutrient deficiency until they break down enough. Yeah, but you can mix it all together. Cool. All right. Planting 101. So we're going to cover mostly these trees, but I just want to talk about each of the major types of trees you might run into, and that's going to be bare root trees, container grown trees, and bald and burlap trees. The bare root trees are oftentimes, if you order fruit trees from a mail order nursery, you will get them as bare root trees. And I know that the City of Durham and Keep Durham Beautiful do often order bare root ornamental trees for planting because they're inexpensive. That's the great thing about these bare root trees.
What was the third one?
Ball and burlap.
Ball and burlap.
Yeah, it's a ball wrapped in burlap.
Cool.
Yeah. So, bare root trees, some of the pros. They're ordered and shipped easily, right? So this is like you can get just the rootstock if you want to do your own apple for $5. You can get one with some grafting on it for more. They're often interesting varieties, right? Because you can be ordering from nurseries anywhere, right? So you can get some weird stuff. Don't be ordering invasives, everyone. Like, be cool. But especially for fruit trees, this is good. And you can easily see and correct root issues. If there's nothing on the roots, it's pretty clear to see when there are root issues, right? When something doesn't look good. The major downside to these trees is that the roots can easily be damaged or dried out. If you ever order a bare root tree, the second you get it, you make sure that those roots have wet paper towel on them, something. You keep those roots moist and you plant it as quickly as you possibly can, right? This is not a tree that you like set in the driveway and come back to 3 days later, right? You gotta move. And they do need a little bit of extra care initially. But a lot of times, you'll receive these trees when they're dormant, right? So it'll look like you get a stick in the mail and you just plant it right away. One of the best reasons to order bare root trees is fruit trees. This is a listing of it's an example of some of the different apples you can get. The details don't matter. Nurseries from all across the country will ship you interesting varieties. You can get an apple that's the tastiest apple on top on a rootstock that'll make it only grow 10 feet tall, right? Any sort of weird thing you want for a fruit tree, you can typically get as a mail order bare root tree. For container grown, this is a lot of what we deal with as homeowners and what you might deal with out planting. You're going to get the best selection, right? You can just go to a nursery and get these things. You don't have to mail order them. You don't have to do anything like that. They're hardy. Contrary to popular wisdom, they actually can be planted anytime. You just are going to have to baby them a lot more if you plant them in kind of the wrong season. So a tree that you buy in the middle of August, you actually can plant. You just need to really stay on top of watering it, right? The problem there was not planting it. The problem was taking it off of a nursery's water supply, okay? So you can plant them any time of year. It's easiest to plant them in the winter when they're dormant because you just don't have to fuss over them quite as much. One of the nice things about them is they're a reasonable weight to move. That's different for all of us what that level is, but they can be a more reasonable weight to move. The con is that they can have significant root defects, which you can correct during planting, but it's true. These trees are grown starting in small pots, moving up into larger pots, and if they are left in a small pot too long before they're potted up, the roots will start wrapping. And if the person is having a long day or maybe didn't have the right breakfast and they don't pay attention, that problem just gets passed on, right? Until you buy it and you need to find it and correct it, and you can. One thing I will say, just as kind of a note for your own personal stuff, if you're gonna buy a container tree, it is better to buy a tree like this one here on the left, with nice branches kind of all throughout, than to buy one like this here that's been pruned up too far. You see how it kind of looks like an upside down witch's broom? Right, whereas this one looks like a tree. You want this. This tree can have a little bit of trouble actually forming its root flare correctly. It just will have a little bit of a growth thing happening that's weird because it was pruned funny. So just get a tree that looks like a nice tree, right, but small. Yeah.
I feel like I've read maybe from Leaf and Lime that they suggest getting trees like as young as possible, and they posit that over time they're actually healthier because they're not growing in a container. Do you think there's merit to that, or it's fine either way as long as it's taken care of?
Yeah, so you'll see the dogwood we have. He's not impressive. He's a little guy, right? Was grown in a container, and so there could be problems like that, and we'll find it. But what I will say is that the smaller you can buy a tree, the better, actually. What Leaf and Limb is saying is right. The idea for that is that the smaller a tree is, the longer it's in the ground where it's going to live, the more time it has to form good roots, to form good structure, to just be a tree, you know, like in its right space. All this moving and up potting and everything else like that stresses the plants, and every time you do it, it introduces a possibility of a root defect or anything else like that. Young trees also don't have as much shock when they're planted, right? Even if you do it when that tree's dormant, it's going to wake up in a radically different environment than it went to sleep in, right? And it will take it time for it to adjust to that. Whereas the younger you do it, younger trees are more resilient, they grow through that shock faster. And so the interesting thing is that in many cases, if I plant a tree that's this tall or even smaller versus a tree that's this tall, by the time that this tree has grown out of its shock, this one will be this tall, and it'll be off to the races and growing, right? So buying a bigger tree doesn't necessarily mean that it will take time for it to grow beyond that, right? So the smaller you can buy, it tends to catch up and even out. Oh, this is an example of being aware of container defects. This is a root that basically came around like this, girdled the tree, killed it. This is the most important thing with container grown trees is really opening up that root ball and looking at what's going on and making sure you fix problems. And we'll show that outside. Bulb and burlap, you might have seen this. This tree was field grown, and then they went in with this massive thing, pick it up, they wrap it in burlap, and they bring it to your house, right? You don't do this yourself. You call someone, they do this for you. These are the largest trees that are available. They may have better root structure of what's left of it because they were field grown. That tree will be stressed for a long time. It will stay that size for a very long time until it's able to grow out of it. But once it does grow out of it, it'll be a big tree. They're very heavy. This is a job for the professionals. You're not going to do this yourself for the most part. And they do have to overcome extensive root trauma. So you're going to be babying that tree for a long time too. Because remember, we're supposed to have a wine glass on a dinner plate. This whole tree now has that much root material, right? It's not enough to really support that tree, so you're going to have to be supplementing with water really regularly. So, preparing for planting. This is kind of a conceptual overview before we go outside. So first thing you want to do is remove all trash, tags, and ties. If you have a tree that comes with a stake and it's tied to that stake, cut all those ties. You don't need the stake. Set the stake aside, right? You just probably don't need it. Anything that you leave on the tree as it grows out and gets wider, it could girdle it, right? Because the tree can't break it, so it'll just probably grow into the bark. Resolve any root defects, right? So this is that example of the tree that was left in the container too long and it started circling and girdling. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to expose the structural roots. These are kind of the first lateral roots, those first more substantial roots, not just little hair like absorbing roots, but kind of substantial ones. We're going to prune girdling roots. If I can't pull that open with my hands and untwist it, I'm just going to start cutting them, right? I would rather kill that root than let it keep going like that. If you have time, like if you're doing this at your house or on a project, opening up the root ball, that means that if you have a bunch of roots that are circling, that are doing other things, you sit there and you literally tease it apart as far as you can. It could take you 20 minutes, right? But you do it. If you don't have time, because you're trying to do a lot of trees or just life, let's be real, you can cut the circling roots, right? So you might have pruners with you, you can do that. If you don't have pruners, you can take the shovel and basically just slice it, right? Yeah.
Which out of the structural girdling and kind of those more lateral roots, which should you be most careful about handling?
At the point where you're in like this, I mean, be careful, but like if you break stuff, it's fine because you're just going through a traumatic moment for the tree. You are, right? Like that's hard to be uprooted like that. Anything that I think is a girdling root, I'm willing to break it if I have to. I would always rather kill a root than let it keep girdling. For damage and that kind of stuff, I mean, I would try to not break as much as I could, but if it's causing a problem, go for it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What happens if you leave it like that?
Oh, I have a picture of it. This. That root kept growing, it wrapped around the tree, and it basically strangled it. Yeah. So that's why you really want to do that, and why that's really important to get rid of anything like that.
Ashley?
Yeah.
So when you're cutting the, ones that are circling, how much do you cut off? And do you cut it so it's sticking out like a star, or you, what do you do?
Yeah, so if I had a root, if I opened this up and I saw that mess, right? Like some of us have seen that on like a perennial that you wanted to plant, right? Where it's just like a white mass. Some of us have seen it on a tree. On a perennial, I can just kind of scrooch it a little bit and start breaking it, and that's really useful. On a tree, they're more substantial, and so what I would do is I literally start unwinding as far as I can. And if I could, I would unwind basically all the way to the point where I can more or less try and convince them to lay straight-ish. They're gonna have a little bit of memory to them, so they're gonna curl, but like I would be unwinding. If I can't unwind, right? Sometimes that happens where you have all these roots circling, you can maybe pull it so far, but you know, it's like a tangled yarn or something, right? You can't get back to the base, you can't figure out exactly where it's coming from. I would cut it as far back as I needed to feel confident, and that will spur a lot of growth in that area, but I just wouldn't leave anything that I could obviously see was circling or that was going into the center of the root ball. Does that make sense?
Is there a certain percentage that you can't cut more of? Like, is that one just a goner, or can you cut all those circling roots?
That could have all been cut. That thing would require a lot of water for a while. I would know that, I mean, that tree is, I hate to say it, it's defective at this point. And so you can correct it, but you're gonna have to water additionally, baby that thing additionally now because you've taken out so much of the root mass, right? And while you're planting, if you have the time, and we'll talk more about this next time, it's a good time to prune any dead, dying, or broken branches, right? Just to kind of clean everything up. Okay, so how do we plant a tree? You want to have a hole that is twice as wide as the root ball. A lot of times when you're planting street trees, that's not possible. The median's not wide enough. Do your best. What I'm saying here is you want a hole that is significantly wider than the root ball. You do not want it any deeper though. You want the tree, when it's sitting there, the top of the soil in the pot, or maybe even lower, to be at grade. Right? There's no benefit to digging your tree, to burying your tree at all. You always want this area, that little flare at the base, the root flare, exposed. Right? So you're going wide, you're not going deep. If you accidentally go too deep, you put that clay back in the hole, you stamp it down to make it hard, and you put the tree on top of it. Because if you just throw some compost in, or if you throw some clay in and that's kind of airy over time, the whole thing sinks, right? You need to like recreate that base. In our soils, you always want to score the sides of the pot, take your shovel and rough up the sides of the pot, because otherwise you can make basically a clay bowl, right? We have these nice, wonderful clay soils. If you just go in with your shovel, perfect. You've planted in a bathtub, right? So score the sides. Again, the top of the root ball should always be at or just above grade, and the trunk flare needs to be exposed. This tissue right here is not root tissue, this is trunk tissue. It's not supposed to be underground. It doesn't want to be underground, it's not built to be underground. You want to backfill mostly actually with our native soil. You can add 5 to 10% compost, but we used to do a thing where we would backfill with compost, or even a 50-50 compost native soil. A lot of research now is showing backfill with your native soil, just the soil that was in that hole. And that's because otherwise what happens is that what's in that hole is so much nicer than everything around it. Yeah.
There.
Yeah, the tree just like grows to the edge, and remember it's growing in response to like nutrient gradients. It's like I'm not leaving, right? And so it'll start turning, right? And it won't want to grow outside that hole. So just break it to that poor tree what it's living in right from the start. Stabilize the base of the tree if needed. When you put the first bit of soil down here, you actually can stomp that as well, right? Because that helps serve as kind of that base, right? To keep that thing in place so it doesn't wobble, right? So that's why we don't have to stake trees that much. Make sure it's straight from all directions. We get really excited. We're like digging our hole. We're going for it, right? And then we step back at the very end. Step back earlier than that. Have a friend with you. Make sure it's actually like looking right, you know? And then especially for smaller maturing trees, redwoods, dogwoods, anything like that, orient your branches as desired. A great big willow oak those lower branches will actually all be pruned off eventually, right? Because it's going to grow up tall and you're going to prune all that out so that people can walk under it and do everything else like that. But a small tree like a redbud, if the branches are pointed like this and the building's right here, right? This would have been better. So orient those branches how you want it. And then finally, a lot of times on city plantings, they do provide you mulch. Mulch is really, really helpful. It helps suppress annual weeds. It keeps the roots cool in the summer. Over time, it adds organic matter to soil. Everybody always gets annoyed that their mulch breaks down and goes away. That's great. That's organic matter being added to your soil. That is the system working, right? And there's a lot of research showing that mulch is much better for trees than turf grass around the base, right? Because if you think about where turf grass grows, the roots are in that exact same layer that the tree's absorbing roots are, right? So now they're in competition. Mulch helps protect against that. Yeah.
But you said there should be some growing roots for the fungi to grow.
This is to kind of just to get the ad started, right? And I'm saying like mulch, especially as opposed to like turf, right? As opposed to grass, because that is, they don't like it. They're not friends. They're not friends. So like in this example, right, this tree has mulch kind of out to the drip line. The root flare is exposed. We never, ever, ever mulch up to the trunk of the tree. We always leave at least a couple inches. But then I could have a lot of other plants out here, you know, shrubs, flowers, whatever, and their roots are still going to be kind of all feeding the same soil.
But why mulch should not touch the trunk?
Because this tissue is really meant to be exposed to air. The sort of terrible comparison I heard that I really liked one time from an arborist was if you think about what mulch is, it's ground up trees. And if you put a bunch of dead ground up trees next to living tree tissue, that would be horrifying, right? Like in any other circumstance, like you do not want a bunch of dead tissue right next to your living tissue, right? So you want that mulch backed off, because what will happen is this tree, not only is it bad from a disease perspective, right? Because you have a bunch of dead, wet tissue right next to living tissue, but this tree will then start sending out tiny roots into that mulch because it thinks it's underground. And then all of a sudden you have all these tiny roots all around the base, and you have to keep kind of mulching up to that point because otherwise those roots die. The whole thing kind of gets destabilized, and it's because you've asked trunk tissue to behave like root tissue, and they're just not the same. Does that make sense? Kind of? Yeah.
I've occasionally had trouble telling the difference between the top of the root and the trunk flare. Would you err on the side of caution if you're not quite sure, just a little bit higher?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If you're not sure where the top of the roots are and where the root flare is, set it up a tiny bit high. Always better to set it up a tiny bit high than to bury it low.
Wait, actually, couldn't hear you?
If you're not sure where the root flare is and where the top of the roots are, you always go a little bit high. You set that plant a little high. You don't bury it low. So, all right. We're going to go outside because otherwise we're not going to. But